Welcome back to another video on the parables of Jesus in their historical context. I'm Samantha Corcoran, and in today's video, we'll tackle the mustard seed parable and the parable of the hidden yeast. While these are separate parables, in our study today, we'll actually put them together. They are what we call parable twins, and they'll have very similar meanings. And so when we talk about them, we'll actually be studying from their account in the book of Luke. We'll be in Luke chapter 13 in this video. Now, you've probably already noticed that these two parables are repeated elsewhere in the Gospels. They're also in Matthew and in Mark. Now, the interesting thing is that the placement is different. Each evangelist places these at different points in the overall Jesus narrative. And yes, there are variations even in the way they recount these parables. So in one parable, the mustard seed becomes a plant. Another one, the word might be vegetable. And another one, it could turn into a tree. So which is it? And does this affect the meaning? Well, actually, it turns out that yes, the details vary, but the meaning, the outcome of these parables are the same. So the textual variations don't really impact the meaning, although it gives us some very interesting discussion points that we'll talk about next up in the video. But first, let's read the parable in Luke. Then Jesus asked, "What is the kingdom of God like? What shall I compare it to? It's like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his garden. It grew and became a tree, and the birds perched in its branches." Let's take each of these items individually, and then we'll pull it all together. First, let's talk about that mustard seed. Yeah, they're pretty tiny, but botanically, they're not actually the smallest seed. Orchid seeds are pretty invisible. So I think here Jesus is using hyperbole to emphasize his point. But as far as mustard seeds go, we can even buy them in our grocery store now. Mustard grows wild. It's common in our cuisine. It really makes me want a hot dog with mustard, like at a ball game. Typical American tradition there. So mustard seeds are kind of ubiquitous now. They grew in the Holy Land. And of course, with Jesus's parables in Galilee, he's literally looking around the landscape to use common everyday things to illustrate his teachings about the kingdom. And so in this case, here's our object right here, the mustard seed. When we look at the plant that little seed grows into, I might need to temper your expectations. I know the biblical text says tree, and when we think of tree, we think big. So why would Jesus use something so small and that really doesn't grow to be that big to describe the kingdom of God? Why didn't he use, say, a cedar of Lebanon? That's a big tree, right? That was used frequently in the Old Testament, right? They used it to build the temple. Cedars of Lebanon, we've heard of those before. So when a first century listener sat there on the hillside and heard Jesus describing the kingdom of God is like, they might have heard cedar that birds took refuge in, made their nests in. Because if you might think of Daniel chapter 4, remember Nebuchadnezzar's dream about the tree, and it covered the whole world, and birds took refuge in it. So there's that. There's also Ezekiel chapter 17, and I think also chapter 31, that also talk about these great trees. And so for a first century listener, they might have expected Jesus to say the kingdom of God is like this huge cedar tree that's majestic, and cedar trees emphasized earthly empires. And they might have thought that might be more appropriate. But that's not what Jesus said. He said it's like a mustard seed that grows into a tree. Okay, So he's not talking about cedars here. So not Daniel chapter 4 or Ezekiel chapter 17 or 31. What does he mean? Okay, well, it's not about a cedar. It's about a mustard seed growing into a mustard plant. So what does he mean? Okay, let's let the mustard seed rest for a little bit. We'll come back to that thought, but I think it'll be helpful if we now compare it to the parable of the yeast, and let's see if this can help us understand what's happening in the mustard seed parable as well. All right, Luke chapter 13, verse 20. Again, he asked, "What shall I compare the kingdom of God to? It's like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour until it worked all through the dough." Now, I'm not sure if you've ever dabbled with sourdough before, but working with yeast is a lot of fun, and it's amazing to watch it grow, transform over time. And I love this picture that it shows day by day. That rubber band was day 4, and you can see where it marked and how much the yeast has grown. Now you have to feed it, you have to take care of it, but yeast can really bring a lot of good results, very tasty results as well. Not to pat myself on the back, but you're seeing a picture of a loaf of sourdough that I actually made. I dabble a little bit in fermenting foods and sourdough, and it's a lot of work, but boy, the results are so worth it. It's delicious. You can't buy stuff like this unless it's from a baker, of course. I was fascinated to read that there are strains of yeast, which, by the way, is in the fungus family and is a living organism. Some strains of yeast were taken by the American pioneers into the West and into San Francisco, California, and those strains of yeast are still being used today in 2022 to make sourdough bread. And it has a very specific taste to it as well. Sourdough tastes different in different parts of the country, different parts of the world. It all has to do with the type of yeast you have. And yeast is fascinating. We could do a whole video on just the yeast, but there is a point to Jesus' story. So let's see if we can find out what that is. Interestingly, the word that's used in our English translations, like in the NIV, says the kingdom of God is like yeast that a woman mixed into dough. Mixed. But that's not actually what the Greek says. The Greek says hidden. The kingdom of God is like yeast that a woman hid in dough. That's a really odd way to say that. We don't hide yeast in dough. So what did Jesus really mean? The reason I'm showing you this loaf is because I kind of wanted you to think about the results of a woman hiding yeast in dough. I mean, the point is the transformation of the yeast and the result at the end. When we try to go back to the first century listeners to think about what would they have heard from this yeast parable, when you think about what the words Jesus said, he did say, the kingdom of heaven is like a woman who hides yeast in 3 measures of flour. And you might think, wait a second. Measures of flour, 3 measures of flour, 3 seahs of flour. Whoa, that's Sarah. In Genesis 18, when the 3 visitors come and Abraham runs in the tent and he says, quick, mix up 3 seahs of flour and make bread for these visitors. They might have thought that. Those 3 measures of flour, the NIV is really kind, and it translates that for us, gives us that actual measurement in modern equivalent, so about 60 pounds of flour. If you've ever worked with flour, you know that it really only takes like 3 or 4 cups of flour to make 1 loaf of bread. Multiply that out. That's enough bread for over 100 people. That is a lot of bread. That is extravagant bread making right there. That could take a team of people. So is Jesus referring to that though? I have this picture here of a Bedouin woman who is making bread in the traditional way that maybe Sarah would have made it. Now you see how she has her flour and she's got a bowl of water there and she's cooking it over a fire. Now this is actually flatbread. There's no yeast in this particular bread. It's flatbread. And so she makes it in a way that you would make a tortilla. And so she rolls it out really, really thin, puts it on that hot plate. Sometimes they'll use a hot stone as well. In modern times, they'll even use gas fires if they're outdoors cooking. And the bread is very thin, but also very soft and pliable, and has some crispy bubbles around it too. Very tasty. And so this is what we should think about when we think about Sarah, because she had to make bread quickly, right? Abraham was like, quick, hurry, make this bread. We've got these guests. And if you think about the Passover and the original Passover in Exodus, when the people had to leave very quickly, did they use yeast in their bread? No, because they were in a hurry. Yeast takes time to rise. You have to be very patient with yeast. And so when we think about the first century audience and what they might have understood, they might have been expecting Jesus to say it's like this, and maybe he was recalling that. But I don't think it's this. Because again, even though it's maybe the same measure of flour, it's not yeast bread. It's flatbread. So what is Jesus getting at? Before we can figure out what Jesus is trying to say, I think it's worth taking a step back and answering this question. What is this parable, these parables, what are they answering? What question was Jesus addressing with these stories? And if you look in the immediate area of Luke 13, you really don't see any questions posed necessarily. Same with Matthew and Mark. Luke puts this story after a healing, which he does for a few others as well. So that's kind of Luke's pattern. But there's not really like a question directly being asked. In order to know what that is, we need to go to Luke chapter 17. And we need to skip ahead a few chapters. And I think this will give us some insight on what's happening. Once, on being asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of God would come, Jesus replied, "The coming of the kingdom of God is not something that can be observed, nor will people say, 'Here it is,' or 'There it is,' because the kingdom of God is in your midst." Question they were really asking is, how could you be bringing God's kingdom? Because we're expecting the Messiah. Just like from Zechariah 14, we're expecting the Messiah to come lead the battle against the Romans. The Messiah is the one who will rescue us from the Romans. But you're not here, Jesus, with a military battalion. You're not riding a white horse to lead the battle. What's happening? How can what you're doing be the kingdom of God? That doesn't compute. So a first century listener would have been expecting Zechariah 14 and Jesus to be leading the charge to defeat the Romans and bring back God's reign and rule to the land. But as we know, that was not Jesus' mission. Through these two parables, Jesus is addressing their doubts. that he is bringing the kingdom. Jesus is trying to explain that just like the mustard seed is planted or hidden, if you will, in the soil, and just like the yeast is hidden in the dough, you cannot see either of them working, but you will see their results. It's the transformation over time that's hidden. These two parables are what we call a similitude. They are a comparison parable. The kingdom of God is like a simile. And they are providing an analogy to the kingdom of God. So the point of these is not about the man who sowed the seed, and it's not about the woman who baked the bread. Rather, it's about how the kingdom is like the process that's described in both. It's the transformation. And so Jesus explains that the kingdom of God cannot be observed. It's already here and it's already working. Even if you don't see it, or if it seems unimpressive, or if it doesn't meet your expectations. As Klein Snodgrass points out, the kingdom time, at that point when he tells the parable, the kingdom time has already begun, even if it doesn't look like it. With Jesus does not come a glorious bang and the defeat of Rome. Rather, it comes unexpectedly, almost unnoticed. But all that is necessary is already there, and the end is present in the beginning. It will come to fulfillment. So just like a mustard seed is hidden in the soil and later grows into a plant that the birds can take refuge in, and just like yeast that is hidden in dough, which will later become a delicious loaf of bread, so is the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is just like that. It may not be what you expect, but it's working, and it's there. As Lois Tverberg says, both parables emphasize this hiddenness or invisibility at first, but then the powerful effect later on. What I love about these two parables is that they really challenge us and challenge our expectations about God's kingdom and how what starts off small and the transformation remains hidden, but you know it's working and there is a result that you will see. It will be fulfilled. And so I want you to think now about times when maybe seeds were planted by God, but we missed it. We didn't notice it. We didn't see it. We had no idea. So I want us to think about mustard seed thinking. We need to change our mindset to this mustard seed thinking and not doubt what God can do with very small things, very small starts. I think the call to action for us is to think about what are our mustard seed moments. Maybe ones that we're aware of, but maybe we need other people around us to help point them out because we might have missed it. God may have planted a seed, but we might have overlooked it. Or maybe it's hidden and we don't know what God has done in the lives of others because of our actions. And so the takeaway from these two parables is I want you to think about what is your mustard seed moment. I'll share mine, and maybe that will help spur your thoughts to what yours is. So my mustard seed moment, I actually had to have my husband Ryan point this out to me. I'm not a naturally reflective person, and I realize I'm asking you to reflect. So to be fair, I'll reflect also. My mustard seed moment happened about 14 years ago. A group of teachers and administrators from our congregation went next door to Oklahoma to a congregation there who designed their own children's curriculum. Now, if you know anything about picking out children's curriculum for Bible class, it is the worst. I'm sorry. It's so hard because things look fabulous and fantastic and colorful and bright, but you get into them and there's no meat. The kids aren't actually learning Bible. So it was a long process, but we came across, what a sister congregation was doing, and we loved it. It is a workshop rotation model, and if you've seen any of my other videos on my channel, you'll know how we run it, because I have a few explainer videos. But at the time, we just thought, this would be really great to do at our congregation. We had no idea 14 years later what the effects would be. Now, of course, speaking with hindsight, that was one of the best decisions we've made in children's curriculum recently. And at the time, though, we're at this meeting, and we've gone through the different workshops through this rotation model. This is where a child would learn the same Bible lesson for 6 weeks in a row, but each week they go to a different workshop, a different room that's decorated differently, different themes. It's based on the theory of multiple intelligences, which I'll have a link down below for you to learn more. Now, at this meeting, we were kind of thinking, now if we did this at our church, who would teach what? Now, at the time, I was a musician, and I was actually teaching some children at church in a music class to sing, to do 4-part harmony. And so everybody thought Sam's going to teach the music workshop. Well, by this point, I had been reading on my own about Bible geography and history and culture, and it hadn't really become a huge thing yet in mainstream Christianity. And so at the time, I was like, we really need to have a workshop on Bible geography and show the kids what it really looks like in the Holy Land, and help them find it on a map, and use Google Earth, which was a brand new thing. And actually, it hadn't been invented yet. It came a couple years later. So the mustard seed moment was when everybody thought I was going to take the singing, the music workshop. I said, no, I want to do Bible geography. People were a little, concerned about that. They're like, really? Are you sure? And it turns out not everybody thought we needed Bible geography. I actually had to fight to get this workshop as part of our children's curriculum. And now, all these years later, it's invaluable. It's even teaching the adults. And that's how this YouTube channel got started, because I had all of this research and I wanted to share it. And now, over 7,000 people have watched 400 hours of video on my channel. And it's nothing I have done. I've just put the content there. I don't do ads. I don't have a lot of social media following about this. It's maybe word of mouth, but the word is reaching people outside of my congregation. This culture and history and geography is reaching people around the world. I've had conversations with people in Australia and on the continent of Europe, and they're all wanting to learn more. And all of that happened from that tiny little mustard seed of that meeting that we went to and thought, maybe we could do this. And here we are 14 years later. Hundreds of children have gone through our children's education program, and it's wonderful to see what God did with that mustard seed of an idea. And how, at the time, we had no idea it would turn into this amazing result. God worked through so many people to make it what it is now, today. And I want you to think about in your life, what are these mustard seed moments? It could just be you run into someone at the grocery store and say a very kind please or thank you, or you hold the door for someone. It could be a random act of kindness that leads to a conversation that leads someone to learn about Jesus. Or, it doesn't have to be big. You don't have to be if you'll forgive me, you don't have to be a Beth Moore to spread the gospel. You can do it with a single conversation and share a story with someone else. And that could allow that seed to be planted and allow God to work on their heart. And they can become a believer as well. And so mustard seed moments are by design small, and you might miss it. So now that you've watched this video and have thought through Jesus's parables, I want you to spend the next week thinking about what are your mustard seed moments, and get help if you need to. If you're not naturally reflective like I am, have someone else point out what they think are your mustard seed moments. And in doing this, you will not miss what God has done and the result that He has brought. I hope this video was helpful to you in your study and your walk with God, and that you'll share it with others. I'll catch you in the next video.